franchisees couldn't It's Jason from game-rave.com, otherwise known as Danger Boy, and this is Game-Rave TV. First, welcome all of our new Twitter fans, YouTube subscribers, etc. I'm so happy to have you guys, and hopefully you show me to your friends, and I get to meet your mom. You know, it's all good. That being said, obviously new opening. We got a fresh set of 25 episodes coming for you, almost like Doctor Who Regenerations, only not as hot as Matt Smith, but that's beside the point. So, while doing some research on some games the other day, I discovered something interesting. The saying is that history repeats itself every 20 years. So I was kind of curious of what happens in between those 20 years. And oddly enough, what happens is that it doesn't matter how popular your game system is, you might actually not get any of the hottest franchises there were at the time, which, believe it or not, even though it sold a billion systems, the PlayStation was actually missing some fairly regular hits and stars to its library. And rather than make like a top 5 or what have you, I figured I'd whittle them down to like the most interesting missing franchises they had. So that being said, let's get to it. Now, our first missing franchise is actually an actor in his franchises. That's Arnold Schwarzenegger. Not including his stint as Mr. Freeze in the Batman and Robin movie/game, he's completely missing from the PlayStation era. During the Super Nintendo and NES days, you had like Predator and Total Recall and, for God's sakes, True Lies, among a whole bunch of other stuff. And then on the PlayStation 2, you saw the return of Terminator and Predator, etc. He's nowhere to be found on the PlayStation, which is kind of interesting for how popular his movies were before and after the time. It's just really interesting. The close second would be Sylvester Stallone. Aside from, if you count Judge Dredd, technically, he's missing too. Kind of interesting. Makes you wonder. Our next franchise that's missing is actually Superman. And if you've followed the Superman games, granted, they haven't had a great track record. Superman's been around since the Atari, and if not before that, NES games, Super NES games, Genesis games, they were completely maxing out the whole Death of Superman thing, etc. And then he just disappeared for a while. Now, while he came back on the PlayStation 2 and later systems with the new movies and so forth, what's interesting is that we actually almost got him. For those of you that know the running joke with Superman 64 and how awful that game was, that same game was planned for PlayStation. In fact, it was so close to being completed and released that it was actually on the ads for the game in all the magazines. But if you've seen all the fun stuff with that game, you know that we dodged a bullet. Thank God. One of our next missing franchises is fairly interesting because the company that had him kind of went off in their own direction during the PlayStation era, and that's Ninja Gaiden from Tecmo. On the NES, you had the Ninja Gaiden 1, 2, and 3, the re-release of them on Super Nintendo on the Trilogy set, the Sega Master System. Japan got the TurboGrafx version. After the PlayStation, the Xbox original got the new Ninja Gaiden Black, etc. And it's not that ninjas were like suddenly not cool or anything, because obviously Mortal Kombat and Ninja were very popular on the PlayStation. It was just Tecmo felt no need to have him in his own game, except for making him a fighter in Dead or Alive. Go figure. Our next missing franchise is actually fairly interesting. It was Indiana Jones. Now, obviously, with the LucasArts type stuff, we got plenty of Star Wars games, even the crappy ones, but Indiana Jones was actually another game that was planned for both the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64, and for whatever reason, the PlayStation version got canceled. The N64 game was actually fairly well done, and unfortunately no one knows why it was canceled on the PlayStation. It's just we never got them. Now, after the fact that the PlayStation's gone, you've got Indiana Jones having like almost like second life, with the Lego Indiana Jones, the Staff of Kings on the Wii. I kind of wish I could have played them. Moving on from our human franchises to our more robotic franchises is RoboCop. Now, just ignore the whole remake that happened, etc. That's a whole other thing. But on the Super Nintendo and NES and Genesis days, RoboCop was finishing up his movie trilogy with RoboCop 2 and 3, and then the Super Nintendo and Genesis also saw the crossover of RoboCop versus Terminator. Arnold Schwarzenegger, nice. And during the PlayStation era, it just went missing again. I believe there was the possibility of there being a game in development, but it got canceled. And then out of nowhere, after the PlayStation was over and done with, there was a game on the original Xbox for RoboCop, but if I remember correctly, it was absolutely terribly awful. But that all being said, we get to, at least in my heart, what is probably the number one missing franchise from the PlayStation. Now, the number one, at least to me, missing franchises on the PlayStation 1 are the original Transformers and G.I. Joe. Now, yes, the Beast Wars have games on the PlayStation, and they freaking suck. And Rat Trap's awesome, but no. With the Transformers, they actually have had a fairly curious gaming world. They, aside from having Commodore 64 games and one Famicom game in Japan, they haven't really ever had a video game lifestyle until recently. Like, even in their heyday, like when they were the number one selling toy in the world, like there was no video game at all for them. In the late 90s, when Hasbro was doing their damnedest to basically destroy them, with, you know, non-transforming Transformers and all the like, Beast Wars technically saved them for a little bit, saved the toy line off from extinction, but really it wasn't until, and I know a lot of people are going to freak out when I say this, but it really wasn't until Michael Bay came along and completely just blew them back out into the mainstream public and made them cool again. There's $3 billion from the films that prove that, and even though we missed Generation 1 Transformers on the PlayStation, they have come back with a vengeance. If you guys haven't played the PS2 Transformers game, which is based off Armada, or the current gen, I guess, still, on the Xbox 360 and PS3, the War for Cybertron and the Fall of Cybertron by High Moon Studios, those games are amazing, and you need to play them right now. They're practically, basically Gears of War, but without the hiding or the chainsaws. I love those games. They're amazing. The other one is actually their co-conspirator, I shouldn't say co-conspirators, but partners, G.I. Joe. As alongside the non-transforming Transformers back in the day of the toys, G.I. Joe really struggled near the end in the late 90s. Like, the last set of figures I remember seeing were like neon ninjas and characters that came with Play-Doh because it was Space Putty or something like that. And although they had two successful games on the NES, they really didn't have anything on the Genesis, and then with the release of the live-action movie, they came back on the PlayStation 2 and other systems. But man, they were just really popular franchises at the time that just didn't come to PlayStation. And what's interesting is that, more than likely just because of licensing problems, there were a lot of games that missed the NES era that should have been out there but never came and could have been done on the PlayStation, like all of Konami's arcade games, like the Simpsons, Bucky O'Hare, X-Men, you know, this 4 to 6 player game, which mostly likely didn't come out because of licensing problems. And there's a whole other big, huge range of games that never came to PlayStation, but these were more the ones that I really thought stood out as not being on there. Alright guys, that's it for this episode. If anything, go back to your own game collections on your most popular systems and see what franchises are missing from them. You'd be surprised. We'll see you next week. Take care.